I'm Annette Benson, and it's my privilege to be the one to welcome you today. Thank you so much for joining us for this meeting of the Purdue Intercultural Learning Community of Practice, the PICLCoP. You may or may not realize it, but this is rather an historic meeting, and I'll tell you why. Recently, in a SILMAR staff meeting, we were discussing that we had a lot of new tools in the Intercultural Learning Hub, the HubICL, that we needed to pilot, and we also had old tools that needed to be piloted in a virtual environment. We strategized that we would set aside one staff meeting per month to demonstrate new and adapted tools to one another. But, staff meeting is online, so we decided we might as well invite our old friends from the Purdue Intercultural Learning Community of Practice, the PICLCoP, to join us for the tool demonstrations. But, if the tool demonstrations were online, there wasn't any reason to limit them to only those on the Purdue campus. The PICLCoP could belong to interculturalists worldwide, not just practitioners at Purdue. So we could become a worldwide community of practice that originated at Purdue. And so this is rather a momentous meeting because this is the first time that the PICLCoP invitation list included people from outside of Purdue. Now, looking at your faces and the list of those of you who are here, I think you all came from Purdue, but the potential was still there. So if you are not a Purdue employee, would you please use the thumbs up emoticon? Nope. Well, I was going to have you all use the heart and the party and the clapping for those who came from outside, but it didn't happen. So thank you for being here. Our presenters for this demonstration are Dr. Aletha Stahl, Senior Intercultural Learning Specialist at SILMAR, and our own director, Dr. Kris Acheson-Clair. At this time, I'll turn the meeting over to Aletha Stahl.
Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to look at the idea of emotion labor, which may or may not be new to some of you. And we're going to do this through an activity, and then we'll learn a little bit more about emotion labor and work on a case study analysis. There are several tools in the hub that you can see linked here that are ready to go. And one of the reasons that we're having this PICLCoP is because we've created some of these tools, but we haven't had a chance to try them out on anybody yet. So thank you. You are also our guinea pigs today. And we appreciate that you're playing that role, and we welcome your feedback. I'm going to start then with an activity called Don't Just Smile. And for this activity, first and foremost, I invite you to take care of yourself. We all bring different things to a space, and if at any point something's going on in your mind and you feel like, I just don't want to be in that space anymore. I'm processing emotions I'd rather take elsewhere. Feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Tune me out, put something else, some good relaxing music or fun music in your ears instead, whatever you need. I don't think this is too intense, but honestly, there are days when it would be intense for me. So just know that. What I'd like you to do now is to think of a work or a school situation in which you would have strong feelings, negative feelings, hurt, anger, frustration, maybe fear. You won't be asked to disclose that situation to anyone. It could be a real situation. It could be something that sometimes you fear could happen. But I'd like you to just take a few quiet moments to go to that place. Then I'd like you to think about emotion words that indicate your feelings during the situation. And often when we have those strong feelings, others are involved. So you can think of emotion words that indicate what one or more other people would likely feel in that situation as well. So here's an emotion wheel that might give you some feeling words, both for yourself in the situation and for others. Feel free to write them or note them or just hold them in your mind. The next thing we're going to do is go into breakout groups. And in those groups, we're going to discuss your key emotions, how easy it might be for you not to show your feelings to the people involved. And then when you think of others' key emotions, and you're welcome to share them in your group, how easy it might be to pretend that you share their feelings or to genuinely share their feelings. And what I'm going to do is break us into groups, and I'll post these questions to the groups so that you have them. So we'll take about 10 to 12 minutes in breakout groups to discuss these questions.
Can I ask a question to clarify the questions?
Please do.
The one that says, how easy would it be for you to not, I think, was show this to the people involved? Is that people involved in your group or people involved in the situation?
In the situation, thank you.
Okay.
People involved in the situation. Okay. You'll be about 3 in a group. Okay. Welcome back. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I invite you to use the chat or to unmute yourself and just speak. We're a relatively small group, so hopefully you can feel comfortable doing that. How was it to discuss how and whose feelings get or don't get expressed?
I think part of it is it depends on the power dynamic in terms of how you could answer either of those questions. So if it was with a peer, it would be one way, but if it's your boss, you're probably going to just keep your mouth shut.
No, are you saying it would also just depend on how deep those feelings were, how important that topic was to you? If it was something, yeah, okay, but if it was something that you felt strongly about, that would be different also.
So intensity of feelings makes a difference. Power dynamics, intensity.
Jody was saying something earlier too.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about, how it depends on who you're talking to. I always wonder why we do hold back from a conversation with someone above us in that power chain, because they're human as well and they have feelings. And I think it makes sense that they would understand we have feelings and emotions, but we do tend to pull back and be cautious how we approach people. And I just find that a funny dynamic because they have feelings as well.
Yeah.
One of the books I read about a year ago was something called Crucial Conversations, and it basically is, how do you speak to power? But even though I've read it and I read their newsletters every week, I'm still afraid to do it.
Yeah, after I read Crucial Conversations, I went and had a crucial conversation. I did exactly what the book said, step by step by step. And I remember when it got over, I looked at my husband and I said, I had a crucial conversation and I did not die.
We had a lot of contextual factors come up in our group as well. Some of the ones that have been talked about so far, but one of the things that hasn't been mentioned so far is how long the situation has been going on and how much your resources for control get worn down over time.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Have you been working again and again and again and again to suppress something or to try to show that you share an emotion? We have some things coming into the chat from Lon. It also depends on how young I was when I had those feelings. When I was very young, I just expressed directly. Now I don't express, right? We learn behaviors. And in that, isn't it because the boss also has power, Jody? Yeah. Yeah. What did you learn from those conversations?
Well, from the conversations we had in the breakout room or from the conversations of the situation?
In the breakout rooms, I was thinking.
Well, for me, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my mic was off actually, hold on. Realize that sort of everybody's on the same boat, right? With this type of things, like you have shared type experience, even though you don't talk about even specific experiences. I think the experience of having in different contexts, either express or suppress, or how all these things that we've just been talking about, for me, it just becomes very obvious that we just all experience them at one level or the other, no matter where we are. And even the boss that now we may not address very directly has another boss that he cannot or she address very directly, right? Or they were at some point where we are, you know, if you think about it. So it's very interesting how that just happens. It's very strange. I mean, Jody's question is really interesting too, because where did that come from, in the sense that we just continue to do it throughout, depending on the powers dynamics keeps changing anyway. It's going to continue to change forever, sort of, in our professional life. And you just automatically pick up on who's the next person that you're going to feel maybe a little bit more intimidated by versus being completely open with someone else. And then it just continues to change. But we were all in all these different spots at different times, right? We're all students, we're all, you know, so it's very interesting. Yeah.
So the situation I thought of in my head was one with a boss, but he also viewed his response was, "Why are you so emotional over this?" Which I was kind of like, "Why are you so hysterical over this?" is kind of what it felt like. So there are situations where talking about your feelings, I don't feel like, or may not get that across in the same way. And I was trying to express a concern about a safety issue in a workplace. So yeah, I expressed feelings, but I feel like had I don't know, either presented differently, or maybe there wasn't anything better I could have done in that situation. But I don't feel like feelings were that there wasn't reception to that at the time.
Do you feel like he had a bias, or she, because you were a female employee versus a guy who had
Yes.
said something about safety? Because that's another layer of things. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so gender playing in, and then what is considered acceptable or not acceptable. So the feelings are already pre-constructed, what is acceptable to express and how. Mm-hmm. Yeah, some good things coming in the chat here. Yeah, good. Thank you. I hope you're all following the chat. Anything else you want to share that you learned from discussing this situation and feelings? I'll ask then, based on this activity, how would you define emotion labor? This is just one angle in, but what are some possible ways of thinking about emotion labor?
For me, it's just having to not show emotion. Or feeling like I shouldn't. And then when I do that, because of the emotion, I struggle with being able to articulate what I really want to say, because I get upset. So, so emotion labor to me is just, emotions can make it really hard to do what you want, what you should be doing.
I find that if I get upset, which is the situations I was thinking about, I'm exhausted afterwards. So getting emotional makes me want to just, check out.
Yeah, thank you. And Heidi?
Hi. So when I saw this term, because I think I've never thought about it in those words, I felt all the things that my colleagues are just sharing, but I also thought of jobs that require you to show emotion, say, for example, a doctor's bedside manner, or a nurse, or something where you may not actually be naturally inclined to be like that, but you are actually required to show some type of empathetic behavior as well that you may or may not be feeling in the moment. So I thought of that effort that it takes to show a specific thing. Sometimes some jobs require that as well, or situations, right? So yeah.
And I think you're all getting at what we're going to move to next, where I'm going to turn this over to Kris. Thank you, and I welcome any feedback about that activity, but where Kris will help us understand what some other definitions and outlooks are. I think you all are getting right there.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the theory of emotion labor, and this research comes from the 1980s. Was where its genesis was, you know, being from the feminist movement, especially within the study of organizational communication. And you can go ahead and advance, Aletha. Hochschild was, and I don't remember her first name, maybe Elizabeth Hochschild, does that sound right? Was the first one to sort of write about emotion labor and explore this as a phenomenon in the workplace. And she was really concerned that that men and women were expected to perform different roles in the workplace, and then that the work that women did was not valued. And so that was the sort of impetus for her to do this research and to really flesh out the theory of what emotion labor is and how it's performed. And one of the important things to understand with emotion labor is that there's a difference between surface acting and deep acting. So surface acting is when you actually don't feel the emotion at all and you're just pretending, right? And then deep acting is when you may not feel that way to start with, but you intentionally, consciously, you know, work on empathizing with other people and generate those authentic emotions. And both of those are kinds of emotion labor, but they have different emotional demands and they have different consequences when you perform them. And then finally, there's that emotional consonance, and that's when it doesn't really take a whole lot of effort at all. You just are naturally empathetic and you resonate with other people's emotions and become sort of in consonance with their emotional states without a lot of effort. Go ahead and on to the next slide here. So the problem with emotion labor is really what Hochschild concentrated on in developing this theory, not just documenting that it's a phenomenon, but saying from a very critical perspective, here are the issues. Here's the big deal when it comes to emotion labor. And the first one is that emotion labor is not expected at the same level or in the same types from all people. So an interesting comment came up in the chat about the differences between expectations for men and women. And this is a great example of that in our culture, at least, it is more appropriate for women to show sadness and for men to show anger. And so then what happens on the job when women are angry? Then they have to mask that and hide it. And what happens when men are sad? They can't show it, right? So there's this hiding aspect of emotion labor. And even though hiding was not in the original sort of triptych taxonomy that Hochschild created with surface, deep, and consonance, it has become a big part of the theory of emotion labor because it is something that people do so often, maybe even more than pretending. They hide, right? And it's become you know, part of the structure of what constitutes emotion labor. So part of the problem here is that it's distributed unevenly. But another problem is that when people are engaging in emotion labor, it's not valued very highly, and especially when it comes to careers that women participate in at greater levels and more often than men. So if you think about female dominated careers like nursing or teaching, there tends to be a lot of emotion labor expected in these careers, and yet these careers are not very highly paid, and the work that people do to perform emotions and to mask emotions is not compensated. It's not, even though it can be draining and it's real work, it's not, it's considered something that you have to do, but not something you get paid for, if that makes sense. And so it's not just about gender, but that is a good example for us to look at this. And so finally, it's not just about the uneven distribution and the lack of compensation, but it's about the negative consequences that can happen with emotion labor, especially excessive emotion labor, and especially with particular kinds of emotion labor. So some of the consequences that are common are exhaustion, burnout, and then attrition. And this just gives you an example, a very concrete example of how it happens, how it works. This is from a study I did several years ago in a rural high school in Georgia. This is actually the high school that I taught at before I went back to higher education and was at Georgia State for a number of years before coming to Purdue. So I interviewed all the teachers at this school, and through a phenomenological and qualitative analysis came up with this model of how emotion labor was functioning. Basically, these foreign language teachers in this rural environment with a community and an administration, frankly, at the school that was pretty openly opposed to the study of foreign language. We're fighting an uphill battle and sort of swimming upstream. And in that context of no support from their community and institutional, context, they were experiencing this burden for motivating students, and they responded to the need to engage their students by performing emotion labor at really high, extreme, unsustainable levels. So they would perform on the stage in front of their classes and excite their students and, be happy and excited and energetic and enthusiastic even when they didn't feel that way, and pretend all of those emotions to carry their students along and motivate them. But they were also hiding all of the frustration and the anger and the despondency and the despair and the discouragement and depression that they were feeling. So it was both the hiding and the performing of those inauthentic emotions. And they became emotionally exhausted. They described themselves as absolutely dragging themselves out of bed in the morning, not wanting to go to work, having trouble making it through the day, falling into bed as soon as they got home, absolutely exhausted physically, but due to that emotional exhaustion. They described a real lack of self-efficacy, feeling like they were not performing at their best, that they were not doing the job that they were capable of doing because of that emotional exhaustion. And it led to this downward spiral where they became even more emotionally exhausted over time because of that lack of self-efficacy and just the utter despair that they were feeling. So eventually they had job burnout, and as of now, there are only one of those 5 teachers that I interviewed is still at that school and still teaching. At the time that I did the study, the foreign language teacher attrition rate in public schools in Georgia was horrific. The average span of a foreign language teacher career was 3 years, and there was a significant number of teachers who taught for 1 year or less and then quit because they just couldn't take it. So obviously there's a problem here, right? Illustrated by what happens and what can happen in situations of extreme emotion labor. So we're going to do an activity. Oh, forgot. We do have the flip side, the positive side, right? It's easy to concentrate on the negative and forget about the positive with emotion labor because the term itself kind of has negative connotations, right? But it is important to recognize that emotion labor can have positive outcomes. And the first one is just that when you are connecting emotionally with other people, so this is not so much the hiding of emotions, but more the performing of emotions, and especially that generation of authentic emotions. So either the more natural, effortless consonance that you have with people, or the deep acting where you intentionally generate that empathy. Those can really create strong bonds with other people, and they can rejuvenate your sense of your emotional well, if you will, right? And fill it back up, leaving you with job satisfaction and positive personal relationships. But this only happens if those feelings are authentic. So it doesn't happen with the surface acting, it doesn't happen with the hiding or the pretending of emotions that are not there, right? So the thing about the deep acting and that generation of authentic emotions is that even though it's more rewarding, it is less common and it takes more effort, right? So to get the reward, you have to put in more of the work, in other words, right? Any questions at this point before we go on to the next activity? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Why does the rewarding kind take more effort? Does that not depend on you personally, like your personality type and all of that?
Well, I think, this is a psychological thing, I think. I think it has to do with you know, the level to which we engage with other people. If we're just putting on a face and, you know, performing as if we're on a stage, that's a sort of effort that is just controlling our sort of outward appearance. But when we are generating authentic emotions, it's something internal that, you know, we're impacting the self, we're impacting our own psyches and our, you know, the sort of internal life that we lead. And I think that does require more effort than, you know, just that surface level. You can think about the iceberg for culture. If you think about an iceberg as a person, if you're just dealing with that top 10% that other people can see, right, it doesn't take as much effort. But if you are really in the well of that 90% that's hidden and impacting the real you, then that's where the more effort comes in. But I think that also ties into the benefits, right? If it's just on top, you're not getting those benefits. But if you're going to the effort to do the real work underneath the water line, that's where the benefits come in as well. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
Heidi
Any other
has her
questions?
hand raised.
Okay.
Hello, I'm just making sure I lower it because last time I forgot. So something about this, I was actually thinking about what Terry, the same thing that the thought that Terry had, I had. And here specifically with teaching and some of these things, I do feel like the cultural context may have a little bit of play a role there because, for example, in Latin America, there's automatically almost like a very strong mentorship, strong bonding relationship with students that happen. Even my students that go to Colombia experience how professors are much more closer. The rapport that you build is a little bit different and it almost happens naturally and the concern happens very naturally. I remember when I did trainings over there when I was working at CIE, we've always, even the questions they would ask on workshops, say, suddenly we're teaching 30 student classes and we have to teach 200, right? Like how to do that change effectively. And here, most of the questions we get would be like, who's gonna help me with grading, logistics stuff, and normal, I mean, which is understandable, but their questions would be like, how am I gonna connect to my student if I know them by name by now, one by one? And how am I gonna know 200? You know, it was all relationship-based type things in addition to the pedagogical stuff. So I also feel like in those contexts, maybe it doesn't require too much of an effort like what Terry was saying, because it just that particular environment or culture, it's almost acceptable and expected that you would go and ask a student about their personal life and how they're doing, and you would notice that and follow up on that much more than in others. I mean, that's just a thought that I had, that it may be a little bit different in some cultures as well, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. So I would say there's two additional layers that we haven't talked about. And one is just the personality layer, right? Like people have different comfort levels with emotionality and with, you know, different skill in expressing or hiding. And some of that has to do with more extroverted and introverted personality types, but some of it is also you know, the way that you were raised and what you're used to. And that brings us to this other level of the cultural, where different cultures have different rules for expressing emotions in different contexts, and different levels of norms for expressivity. And one of the things that we were talking about in our earlier breakout room was how when you come from an expressive culture, then hiding becomes more hard. But maybe when you come from a more restrained culture, perhaps the performing is more hard, right? So definitely that cultural layer is important, and we have to keep that in mind. Even though it's not written into the original theory, I think it's definitely something that in reality, when it plays out in our relationships, it's something there, ever present. Yeah. All right, so if there's any other questions, you go ahead and put them in chat and I'll get to them. But let's go ahead and move on to this activity. It's basically placing emotion labor the focus on careers. So we're going to take a look at some of the research that's been done in various professions with emotion labor by looking at some case studies. And here are some examples of some of the research that's been done with different types of careers. So we've got medical professionals, lots of things about nurses and physicians, also mental health professionals. And then you've got sort of the more social services type things. So you've got childcare, criminal justice, lots of different examples of that in various contexts. Also social workers, clergy members. And then you've got the sort of entertainment type folks. So you've got hospitality and tourism professionals, and then probably the most relevant to this group. We've got educators. So is there any that you wish were on this list or you think should be on this list, or you're curious if it has been studied? Do you think there are some professions that are missing here where you think emotional labor is a big deal? Customer service, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say secretaries.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, anybody who's front facing to clientele, right? Mothers. Fantastic. Thank you for bringing that up. You know, talk about uncompensated labor, right? This is something that, boy, you have to control those emotions and you have to pretend those things that you're not feeling, definitely in that role. Parent in general, not just mother. Anything else? Any other professions you think should be on this list?
Could politician fall under there?
You know, it hasn't been studied to my knowledge, but I think that's a really good point. You know, when you are not just public politician, but any public figure, right? Anybody who has a public life, you're performing a role out there in social media and in the spotlight, and so the control and the pretending, I would think, would both play a role.
The problem
think
with politicians, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say flight attendants.
Flight attendant has definitely been studied with emotional labor. Mm-hmm.
I guess what I was going to say about politicians is I think it might depend on the politician. I think if a politician is truly empathetic, you know, yes, there's a lot of emotional labor, but I think there's some politicians, it's all just about themselves. So I'm not sure I see a lot of emotional labor if you're narcissistic. Oh, maybe that shouldn't use that word.
Again, I feel like this is probably gendered, right? I imagine that female politicians might end up doing more emotion labor than male politicians. Maybe male politicians could be more free to express the emotions they have and maybe aren't as expected to fake emotions that they don't have, at least in our culture. But again, that one has not been studied to my knowledge, so I would be curious if anybody would want to take that up. All right, so we are going to, oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, maybe this goes under medical professionals, but having heard a lot of stories from a good friend who's a veterinarian during the pandemic, would also, yeah, clients, yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, I don't know if you know, but the suicide rate among veterinarians is just horrendously high. And there's sort of a dual burden there, because you're empathizing with the patient, the animal patient, but you also have the paying client who's the family. And yeah, very, very complicated emotion labor there, I think. All right, so we are going to move into this case study analysis. What we're going to do is there's two stages. First, we're going to move into groups, and each group is going to analyze an existing case study from the research, and then we're going to come back and discuss and report back. And then in the second breakout room, you're actually going to be creating your own emotion labor case studies. All right, so here's how this will work. We've got 5 case studies and 15 people, so I think as long as all of us go into a breakout room, we should have 3 people in each room, and so we can use all 5 case studies. But if you do this activity, you can decide based on the number of people. You know, we could have 3 groups of 5, or we could have, you know, however many case studies you wanted to use. So here is the breakdown. I'm going to put this in chat about which group will be doing which case study. So take a look at this. You won't know until you're invited to your group which group you're in, but before you hit the join button, try to take a look and see, match the number of your group to whichever one is the case study there. I'm also going to, in preparation, you need to download all these case studies before you leave, before you go into your breakout rooms. So okay, so here's what we should do. I'm going to send an email very quickly to everybody that is here. I'm going to send an email real quick with all 5 files attached so that when you get into the room, you'll know right? Which one? I'll do that while Annette or Aletha sets up those breakout rooms of 5 breakouts with 3 people each. And then again, before you join, make sure you know which group number you're in so that you know which of those files you're supposed to look at. All right. So thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. As soon as you're in your groups, your task is to take a look, read through the case study. And then there's a set of questions inside the case study. They're also on a slide, but you don't need them on the slide because, like I said, they're in each document. But it's just going to ask you to analyze that case study and be ready to talk back to the whole group when you get back. Okay. So also within your group of 3, if you could choose one person to tell us a little bit about that case study when we come back from the group, that would be fantastic. All right. Here we go. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience with our technical snafus. I'm working with limited internet, and like I said, Zoom keeps updating on us and changing the rules. So thank you again for your patience. So we are going to have folks debrief a little bit from what they talked about in their groups, keeping in mind that nobody else read your particular case other than your group. So you need to give us enough details about what your case was so that we understand what your discussion was afterwards and what insights you carried away from it. So, so if each person, I'll just call out the name of one of these case studies, and whoever was talking about that particular one, would your group leader can tell us a little bit about the case study itself and then what your takeaways were. So the first one, let's do nurses.
Do you want us to fishbowl like we did last time, or I'll stay on?
That would be really great. If you're reporting back from your group, if you'll leave your camera on and everybody else can turn your cameras off, and that way, and you can stop the share as well. And that way folks who are talking will be big on the screen. Yeah, perfect. So if you don't see 5 people on the screen right now or 4 people on the screen right now, change your view to gallery and hide non-video participants. And then you should just see Dan and Lon and Terry and myself and GEPP and Raylyn. Yeah, okay, good. So if you're not reporting back from your group, you can turn your camera off, but if you're talking to me about your case study, then go for it. So who's got nurses?
We did.
Okay, go for it.
So as you can imagine, and we even mentioned this as an example before, it's an intensive sort of, they have a lot of aspects of emotion labor that go within that profession, right? Things in gender, race, that happen in that. First, there's a pressure, in a nutshell, there's a pressure, first of all, that nurses, most of them are female, right? And people still get surprised when they see a male nurse. And if they see a male nurse, there's also the case study mentioned, like sometimes when people think of male nurses, they picture more like, oh, these are mental health scenario type nurses, right? Because they need the strength or whatever, versus general nurses are in just hospital. And then there's the added pressure too of nurses, female nurses, that they have to be like really the angels of the situation, right? Motherly figure, caregivers, and there's that type of stereotype, right? And so, and people may resist the male nurse and may not like them to take care of them in simple tasks as, say, washing a patient and things like that because of these expectations. And when people have, in the case study, it says like this can be mentioned, it can be perceived by some people as being sexist, right? And by colleagues and also doctors and patients. But it was interesting that in the study, some of the nurses claimed that this was actually crucial for to show emotion and empathy and everything is crucial to their jobs, and they actually appreciated that this is something that they get to do. I guess it's as part of their job, meaning like it's important for them to do it. But do you want us to just give the whole summary of sort of everything? Or
yeah, no, so this is good. I just wanted to comment. I have tons of nurses in my family, and one of the things that you're saying is really resonating with me, and that's this sort of expectation of caretaking. But the flip side of that, I think, is they often talk about how their knowledge is not valued. In other words, especially in conversations with doctors. It's almost like you're here to do this job of caretaking and nurturing and taking care of people's bodies and their emotions, and then you just leave all the cerebral stuff to me, you know.
Yes.
But at the same time, what you were saying about how much they value that aspect of their job, I have several nurses in my family who are like, I would never want to be a doctor. I enjoy being a nurse because I get to be in that close relationship and have contact with my patients in a way that I wouldn't be able to if I were a doctor, because I'm in the room for 5 minutes and you know I'm expected to do other things, you know.
Yeah, and they actually said that, yeah, doctors are like keeping their distance and all these things, exactly. And so it's a lot of the potential toll of emotional labor actually was that, right? Like the demands from patients, but lack of support from colleagues that could lead to emotional burnout and things like that. And it's, I would imagine that many nurses would feel this way anywhere, precisely because on some level there's a big expectation, and on the other, they're still, like you said, they may be very knowledgeable, like nurse practitioners and things like that, and then they may face distrust even from patients, right? Sometimes people go, it's like, oh, you do a checkup and you do it with a, nurse practitioner versus a doctor, and some people may actually have a little bit of a distrust there as well, right? And they are very knowledgeable.
Yeah. Annette, you popped in. Did you have a comment about nurses? Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't find my raise hand function. I thought maybe if I just showed up, you'd know.
Yeah, definitely. I know you have a male nurse in the family, so I figured
I have a lot of nurses in my family. And one of the reasons I didn't become a nurse, I didn't have words for it, but it does involve emotion labor. I knew that I could not do that emotion labor. But you were talking about positive emotion labor. I have a cousin who works in ICU, so there's tons of paperwork to be done and a lot of monitoring of machines and that sort of thing. But the other day, an African-American gentleman was dying of COVID, and she got to go in her PPE and hold his hand as he died. And because he was African-American, she put on Aretha Franklin singing Amazing Grace, hoping he would like it, that it would be meaningful. And she's absolutely been on a high about this experience of getting to do what she thought she was going to do when she became a nurse. This was true nursing to her, where the rest of it is labor. And so I think that's an example of a positive emotion labor, isn't it? Or not?
Yeah, I think so. It's an example of how it sort of refills our well. And the interesting thing is that the positivity or the negativity of the emotions themselves doesn't seem to matter in terms of how emotion labor drains us or doesn't. It's the authenticity that's the factor there. So it could be that you're performing sadness along with someone and it's not necessarily draining, right?
Interesting. And tied to that, actually, one thing that we did talk about that wasn't specifically put on the written in the case studies, that it may be possible, and maybe it's a stereotype, I don't know, but we've sort of observed, and both we could think of examples from our own life, my colleague and I, that you may start, especially as a younger professional in the nursing type, something like what Aletha was just describing. You can start with a lot of genuine, empathetic interest and be super caring and give all that you got emotionally, I mean, like to your patients and everything, and to the patients. And then I feel like at some point, if you see people are dying close to you, you're seeing all these things, this could also be something that with the years, you may you have to get desensitized, how do you say that?
Desensitized.
Like, a little bit, because otherwise you go crazy as well, right? So maybe this is a profession where the longer you are, you may also need to put up actually a performance along the years, because otherwise it will be too tolling on you if you're so invested in every single patient. I don't know. And like, Jody commented that it's true. Like they could notice, for example, in some specific situation where a younger female nurse will be a little bit more enthusiastic about caring for a specific person in the family versus some of the other ones that had more experience were like, no, it's not necessary. It's fine. Just leave it at that type of situation, right? Because they've had more experience with this. So that could be a way of coping, perhaps, for some people if it gets to be too much on a day-to-day basis, where you just start becoming a little bit less involved and maybe pull out more of the performing piece, perhaps. I mean, that could happen.
It makes sense, yeah.
And yeah.
So just in the interest of time, let's just do one more. And I want to do one that's very different from what we've talked about before, and that's the adventure tours one. Did a group do that one? The adventure tours leaders?
Yes, yeah, we did that.
Awesome. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Okay, so the description of it real quick, sorry. Pull this up real quick. Was let's see. Adventure tour leaders are required to manage their emotions during challenging and stressful situations, also tasked with keeping their clients calm as they navigate unpredictable natural environments. So one of the examples that one of our group came up with was we were picturing like somebody leading a whitewater rafting tour. So in terms of what challenges do workers in the profession detailed in this case study tend to face, just the whole thing about, keeping your clients calm and having to demonstrate that calmness and keep yourself calm, while at the same time you've got to get everyone to follow instructions specifically to keep them safe. Right. So you have to have a command of the situation and stay calm, but then they would also feel the pressure of wanting everyone to enjoy themselves. And how do they perform emotion labor in response to that challenge? Portraying calmness and competency in all situations. Keeping command of the situation while directing safe behavior. So picturing a little bit of, if they see something that's not safe, they can't necessarily show that reaction. And then another group member mentioned the importance of developing authentic relationships with the folks in the group. And
so
then
one thing I just want to make sure that you're highlighting, if my memory serves me right, there wasn't a gender difference in this one, right?
Correct. They thought there was going to be. The information said that going in, they thought that there might be a difference between how the men and women would do that they thought there'd be more of it for the woman, and it turned out that that was not the case.
Right. Yeah. Any strategies that they recommended?
Let's see.
Or that you all talked about?
Yep, let me jump down to that one real quick. Yeah. I mean, basically the strategy was to put it into the job ads that, so we were, kind of laughing about that because, it's like basically just warning folks before you apply for this job that you better be ready to deal with this. And that was really the only strategy that we saw.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just in the interest of time, so if you were doing this activity, obviously you would need a longer stretch of time. You would continue to debrief all of the different cases, and then you would send people out back to their breakout rooms and do a creation of a case study based on whatever careers people have had, are in currently, or are planning for their futures, if you're talking about maybe undergraduate students, and then come back and debrief again, and especially I think concentrating on the strategies. So this is one thing that we haven't emphasized so far, and I want to bring Aletha back in to just for the last few minutes help me debrief, because we want to think both about strategies on the individual level, which has come up a little bit so far, but also more structurally, like at the organizational level, what can be done about emotion labor, what kinds of intentional policies, practices can we put into place that that might be helpful. Okay.
Also, how can we prepare students for these professions? I'm not sure I would have gone into teaching high school if somebody had told me the labor involved, the emotion labor involved. I'm not sure anybody would. Just kidding.
So yes, personal level, but we also have a question in there about organizational level. Anybody have any insights about strategies that we can put into place or use at either of those two levels, and also Annette's point about how do we pass this on to students?
So we fostered children And I think that required a ton of emotional labor to put yourself in the position of not having negative feelings towards parents that you feel like maybe did something wrong or should have known better, being supportive of children that you know absolutely nothing about, and wanting to provide them with love and safety while also protecting your own heart, knowing that they probably would leave. So for me, and something that I suggest to people whenever I talk about this with anyone, we don't know the end plan, and we don't know what we do, how it affects someone else in the long term. So a moment of kindness, a moment of good words, a moment of fair behavior and things like that can affect people more than you think and for much longer than you think. So that was something that we had to keep in mind while we went through that very emotionally difficult time, just hoping that we made a difference in someone's future. And I think that is true whether you're teaching college kids or whether you're taking somebody's infant from the hospital, you know, to raise as your own. So just have to know we don't always know the outcome.
Thank you for sharing that, Jody. I think one takeaway for me of what you're talking about is like staying in the moment, you know? Is that a strategy that's helpful in other types of emotion labor outside of the fostering context? You know, not thinking ahead about consequences to whatever's happening now, not thinking years down the road even, but staying in the moment. Does that help? Aletha, you were telling me something earlier about institutional strategies, or something that you had learned or had occurred to you as you were reading something. I don't remember exactly what you were talking about.
I'm thinking maybe not that, but even, you know, these days when you spend a little bit of time in a departmental meeting, just catching up with each other, what it means to nurture the relationships that allow then for more concurrence to take place, or for people to want to make that deeper investment in sharing emotions so that there's more return. I think especially in a virtual setting, what institutions do, you know, even a structure like Silmar or your departments can really make a difference, I think, in people's ability to sustain. And so I don't know, that translates on all kinds of institutional levels. Pre-COVID also, you know, what are the structures in place?
One of the nursing articles that is probably one of the most cited emotion labor pieces of research talks about a success story with a particular nursing unit, and they had a very structured and rigorous mentoring program with, you know, internal mentoring program that paired older nurses and younger nurses, not necessarily by age, but by experience level, right? And it had a very positive impact on the costs of their emotion labor. So I would put that forward as a potential strategy at the institutional level. Well, we are about out of time. I think there's another slide in there that shows which other activities in the HubICL are available with emotion labor. This is something that we've been working on just in the past few months to get as many activities out there on this theme as we could. So there's 4 that I know of now, but if we would welcome, if folks have other ideas about how you could explore emotion labor with students or with other kinds of learners, we would welcome additions to this collection. Annette, do you want to add anything else as a wrap up?
I put in a proposal at a conference for February that I would demonstrate tools on emotion labor, and I kind of wanted to see how it went. So thank you for being the guinea pigs. I think it went quite well. And
other than the tech issues.
Other than the tech issues. And it did help me really to see how to bring in the cultural aspect of this. I think I would spend more time at that particular conference on the cultural aspect of it as well as gender. So thanks a lot for attending, and it's 12:30. I'm standing between you and lunch. I'll see you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.